I will just thank you guys for joining us today to share the findings of the 2020 Domicile Unknown. We're here today with Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafoury, Street Roots Executive Director Kellee Azar, Tri-County Health Officer Dr. Jennifer Vines, Harm Reduction Clinic Specialist Julie Lukesh. We're also joined by Hope Yamasaki, whose son died last year. And we have Chief Medical Legal Death Investigator Kim DeLeo, who will be available to take questions at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Chair Kafoury.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks everyone for coming today. I'm Deborah Kafoury, Multnomah County Chair. And I really appreciate everyone participating this morning. I'm going to make some remarks, and then you'll hear from one of the report's primary authors, Dr. Jennifer Vines. As Kate said, we'll also hear from Kellee Azar, Executive Director of Street Roots, and Harm Reduction Clinic Specialist Julie Lukesh. And we are incredibly grateful to be joined by Hope Yamasaki, who's the mother of Christopher Madsen Yamasaki, who passed away on February 27th, 2020, without a place to call home. And then we'll have questions. We have the Health Department Director, Ebony Clark, and Chief Medical Legal Death Investigator, Kim DeLeo. So we're here today to formally release Domicile Unknown, which is our annual report and analysis of people who died in Multnomah County while experiencing homelessness in the previous calendar year. For over 20 months, we've had to navigate the grim realities of COVID-19, overwhelming need buckling our hospital systems, new and increased disparities straining our safety net to its limits, and hundreds of thousands of deaths that have cast a long shadow of trauma. And in light of such pervasive, persistent grief and loss, it might be tempting to turn our eyes away from this year's Domicile Unknown report, which tells us that 126 people died while experiencing homelessness in Multnomah County in 2020. But even as we continue to grapple with widespread global tragedy, we can't and won't allow ourselves to ever deny, minimize, or become accustomed to the deaths of our unhoused neighbors. Over the course of 9 reports, Domicile Unknown has done more than simply remind us that the weather, violence, trauma, and instability that people are exposed to when they don't have safe housing is often fatal. It also reminds us that behind each death is a name, a family, a set of circumstances, and a story. That those who experience homelessness at some point knew the safety, stability, and protection of a home. That is, for much as we want one, there is no simple one-size-fits-all formula for addressing the complexity of someone's homelessness. That regardless, each person accounted for in this report deserved safe, stable housing, as well as access to mental health services, addiction treatment, and physical health care, that together can give people a real fighting chance to avoid early death, to find their footing, and even to thrive. And while we can't expect one report to tell the entire story of homelessness in our community, the stories and numbers in Domicile Unknown help us to focus the picture of why and how people succumb to it. So with this information in hand, we know who to grieve, and we know whose names to remember. And with this information, we can and do act. Domicile Unknown has repeatedly served as a force for change. Over the years, the analysis have driven many of the counties and even the state's policy directions and advocacy around the life and death challenges people experiencing homelessness face. Past reports painted a harrowing picture of just how devastating and fatal the opioid epidemic was to people experiencing homelessness. And that information lit a sense of urgency into decisions like mandating safer prescription practices, expanding treatment options like medication-assisted treatment, and broadening the availability of naloxone. The report's analyses have also been critical to helping us understand where and when shelter access is needed most, guiding our efforts to not just expand our shelter system, especially during bouts of extreme weather, but also to find ways of making them more inclusive and supportive. Through the Joint Office of Homeless Services, we began expanding supportive housing in 2017, and since then we've opened hundreds of new permanent supportive housing units with more than 1,000 in the pipeline. In the passage of Senate Bill 850 last session, jurisdictions now across the state can begin collecting Domicile Unknown information of their own to bring their local pictures of homelessness into better focus, and to turn that understanding into urgent action. And the truth is, even as we have moved to meet the challenges that put the lives of unhoused people at risk, new ones like a generational pandemic or the surge in a shocking, dangerous, and destructive new form of meth have emerged. The tens of thousands of masks, water, and sleeping bags distributed by our staff to mutual aid groups, not just during ice storms and heat domes, but all year, made a difference to keep people safe. The 8 motels we opened to safely shelter hundreds of people at the highest risk of fatal infection made a difference. What Domicile Unknown makes exceedingly clear is the resilient, life-changing, life-saving difference that a safe home to live in, healthy human connection, and accessible support services can make. And that's exactly why we continue to work diligently, urgently, to advance interventions that help keep our neighbors and help our neighbors find stability, safety, and a path forward. That includes the work to finally scale up the services, programs, and resources that connect people to the stable housing they need to stay alive, or to help them keep their housing, or access a shelter bed and get other immediate needs met, or find behavioral health services, all thanks to the Supportive Housing Services Measure. Our first of its kind downtown behavioral health resource center is also on the horizon for people who experience chronic homelessness because their or undertreated behavioral health challenges create unscalable barriers to housing. This report tells us that we can't arrest or sweep or warehouse our way to saving lives. Too many of the victims documented in this report died because they needed something more than that. They needed housing along with the relationships and support to help them heal, recover, and move forward. That's why I remain profoundly thankful that the voters last year gave us the money to significantly expand supportive housing, the kind of housing that will save lives and fill in the gaps where our neighbors' lives fell through. That funding is also critical to supporting staff who work hard to build trust and maintain relationships with those living outside, to expanding and creating new entry points to services, and to increasing the resources people can access right now to meet their most urgent needs, all part of what it takes to move people off the street and into a home. And as this work takes flight, so does my sense of hope for the difference that we will be able to make in people's lives, as well as my sense of gratitude for everyone in the community dedicated to this work. This report makes clear that we must see that work through. We cannot stop short, only sanctioning tent camps or only seeking other strategies that merely move people out of sight and convincing ourselves that we've somehow done the right thing by the people we've lost year after year. And there's something else that this report calls us to do. By remembering those who passed as fully realized, complex people as our neighbors, we can sustain the connection, conviction, and resolution to make things better for those who are still alive. As these stories make clear, it's that human connection and relationships are critical to ending homelessness. It's not just bricks and mortar and smart programming that saves lives, it's other people. Like the incredible people who are working on the front lines and making those connections every day. Their work gives us hope. Their work creates opportunity. We can honor those who were overcome by the undeserved trauma, the brutal isolation, and the elements by working together to end homelessness. Before I pass it on to our Multnomah County Health Officer, Dr. Jennifer Vines, I want to be sure to express my deepest gratitude to the families of Christopher Madsen Yamasaki, Amber Kotri, Ryan Holmesley, Michael Bowen, Andrew Howard, and Harold Major for being so generous and forthcoming with their memories. We grieve alongside you. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Chair Kafoury, and good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Jennifer Vines. I'm the Multnomah County Health Officer. This is the 9th year for this report. It's actually my first to share it with you as the health officer. And I first want to highlight it's an example of the really important work that the Multnomah County Medical Examiner program does day in and day out to understand how and why people die. Difficult as it is to review deaths in this way, it creates knowledge and it fuels our ability to act. And I want to thank them for their service and their compassion for families. The defining event of 2020 was, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, but I don't want to blow past a finding that stands out immediately to me, which is the young average age of death and the young ages of the people highlighted in this report. And again, I echo the gratitude to their families for sharing their stories. These are years of life loss that really have almost no comparison globally in terms of life expectancy, just based on this sample of 126 people. So I will talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular, the surprising finding that none of these deaths were attributed to the virus. So a lot of effort went into protecting this particular population early in the pandemic. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that there have been disproportionate effects on others in Multnomah County, in particular communities of color, and so much work we still have to do to address the racism and the underlying conditions that are contributing to the suffering of COVID-19 among people in Multnomah County. But at least we can look at this report with a critical eye and wonder if we could have undercounted deaths due to COVID-19. So let me just spend a few minutes answering that question. So this report is based on medical examiner death investigation. So it does not include individuals who would have been hospitalized or had a long hospital stay prior to a death that was determined to be natural. So that could miss cases. But death investigators for cases that are in their jurisdiction routinely tested for COVID if that person had any symptoms of illness in the days before their death, or if a family requested it, just to be sure. So death investigators perform routine medical chart review, and we have to remember that routine testing through healthcare was limited early in the pandemic. It was largely limited to hospitalized patients in the early months. So that could have been a reason to undercount. Another reason could have been just the timing of our biggest wave of COVID in 2020, which happened late in the calendar year. So the timing of deaths from that wave could have resulted out in early 2021, which means they'll be detailed in the 2021 Domicile Unknown report. The young average age of people that I already mentioned who died while experiencing homelessness suggests that this is a young population, a relatively young population, and we know the risk of death from COVID increases with age, so that would be a reason to believe these numbers. Finally, another reason to believe this finding is that lack of confirmed deaths due to COVID actually aligns with our local experience of disease transmission. So we had essentially no known outbreaks among people living outside last year and relatively few shelter outbreaks in 2020. So I'd like to turn to one other finding that stands out to me in this report, and that's the role of methamphetamines. So methamphetamines contributed to 62 deaths, so almost half of all deaths and nearly 80% of all the deaths involving substances. And that's the highest total number and the highest percent of total cases since this analysis began back in 2011. So just briefly, unlike opiates and alcohol, which tend to slow people down, make them less alert, meth is actually a stimulant. So it energizes people. It can lead to a very fast heartbeat. It can lead to high blood pressure, and it can overstimulate the brain, leading to violent or erratic behavior. Meth can also worsen or even provoke a mental health crisis. We're hearing reports that meth is stronger, cheaper, and more available on our streets. And unfortunately, unlike opioids, there's no treatment that eases meth intoxication or helps with recovery. So there is no equivalent of naloxone, which reverses an opiate overdose, or Suboxone, also known as buprenorphine, which can help a lot with withdrawal and cravings for opiates. The bottom line is that people need a quiet, safe place to relax, to hydrate, to have some food, and to recover from their meth use. So because substance use figures so prominently in this year's particular report, as it does in many other years, I'm going to turn it now to Julie Lukash from the Multnomah County Harm Reduction Services to speak a little bit more in depth. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Vines, for that introduction. I work at our program's harm reduction clinic out in Northeast Portland, and we are seeing an absolute increase in community members and neighbors who are substance affected and having a lot of difficulty finding places to recover. The only thing, as Dr. Vines mentioned, that can help with recovering from meth intoxication is rest, food, and fluids. Due to what we all are aware of with COVID, there are many way less availability of places for folks to be safe and to recover and to be warm. So when people are using meth and they don't have a safe place to rest, to get sleep and food and take care of these primary physical needs, they're much more likely to experience meth psychosis, especially if they're already dually diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And they don't have a chance or a place to de-escalate. And the reactions from the community are often negative when people are moved from one place to the next without a place to be safe. So as a result, we see an increase in violence nationally and locally, and this puts people living outside it so that they're just staying awake for their own safety. Meth helps with staying awake. Unfortunately, it's cheaper and easier to utilize. So the other thing that we're seeing is that we're turning folks away from the clinic that I work for because we don't have enough resources to do wraparound services for folks in addition to what we're already offering, which is STD screening, naloxone, wound care, and referrals to resources. But when people have to hop from one building to the next, they don't often make it. Lack of transportation, lack of resources to get from one place to the next, even lack of things that you and I take absolutely for granted, like just a telephone. There aren't telephones to use right now because of COVID. You can't borrow a phone from somebody without putting yourself at risk. These really simple things that we might not think of are hardships for these neighbors out on the street. Our hope is that with Measure 110 funding, we'll see more access to behavioral health services that might include sobering centers staffed by experts who can lift up this problem and support our neighbors who are really, really struggling right now. We have great examples, a couple great examples, but not enough already in our community. Central City Concerns Blackburn Center is a great example for really great wraparound health and social services. They cannot carry the burden for our entire Portland metro area. We need a lot more Blackburn centers and places for people to feel safe, to feel cared for, to walk through the door and know that their needs, maybe not all of their needs will be met, but many of them will be met with a smile and a welcome and humanizing and treated with dignity. These are really, really big keys to helping folks get back on their feet. I'm going to turn it over to Hope now, who's going to speak a little bit more about all of this from a very, very personal angle. Thanks, Hope, for joining us today.
Thank you. Is my volume okay?
Yep. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm Hope Yamasaki. My son, Christopher Jordan Madsen Yamasaki, he was born in 1993. He was a beautiful baby. He was curious and excited about life. He loved bowling. He and his brother bowled tournaments and won trophies. He even bowled a 300, which is a perfect score. He went to the Metropolitan Learning Center with his two siblings in Northwest Portland. He was an outdoor school leader. Every fall, he volunteered to build a really fun haunted house for the younger kids. Every winter, he was part of their winter solstice program, decorating, dancing, drumming, and doing art. After high school, he went on to Job Corps and got certificates in welding and plumbing, and then he was then offered a position in AmeriCorps working in wind technology and flown to Colorado. He was very excited about that. That's also when he had his first major mental health breakdown. He was later diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. For the next few years, he was in and out of inpatient mental health treatment. He got on disability, and he was able to live in a house with folks who were experiencing similar things, for counseling and help remembering medications. He did well, and he started online college and was even working part-time. He moved into his own apartment because he wanted to be independent, but sadly he couldn't remember his medication regularly, and he started using drugs, which completely made the issue much harder. And the previous types of house that offered Chris support were no longer available for him. For the next year, he rotated between trying to get help for addiction and trying to get treatment for mental health. He would be asked to leave addiction centers because they can't treat mental health. Then he would be asked to leave the mental health hospital because they can't treat addiction issues. He didn't want to leave. Sometimes he would beg to stay. He did want help. The last time he was kicked out of the mental health center, it was in the middle of the night. He was dropped off at a shelter 12 hours before he was scheduled to be transported to a dual diagnosis center that might be able to help him. His state was so bad, he didn't even remember how to call me, and he lost his spot at the center and had to go back on the waiting list. We tried to get him into walk-in detox at many different places. He wasn't accepted at any of them because the demand was so high and he was using meth, and they thought that would be less dangerous. We took him to mental health hospitals again, but they would only treat him for a couple days, not even long enough to get the medication right. This type of thing happened over and over and over again. He desperately needed dual diagnosis treatment so he could get addiction and mental health treatment at the same time. On a clear Saturday morning in February 2020, just before the world shut down, a police officer knocked on our door. My daughter and I could feel something was very wrong, and she begged me not to answer. I had to, and I learned her brother and my oldest son left this world. He was kicked out of a shelter because he was smoking on a fire escape and acting erratically. He was found in a tent in Northwest Portland, not too far from where he went to school. He overdosed on methamphetamines. He was only 26. I don't remember what I said to the officer. My daughter and I just hugged and stared out the window. We watched the clouds come in, and as our tears fell, so did the rain. And the harder I cried, the harder it rained until it was hailing. It was like the universe knew and felt this loss and agreed it shouldn't have happened. And this is increasingly common as our class divide increases, and I'm afraid it's getting worse. Chris had me advocating for him and desperately trying to get him help, and it is still not enough. I feel so much guilt and sadness, but we desperately need dual diagnosis centers and walk-in detox, safe places for people to be who are on meth, and we need better options. Help is not as easy to get as many people think. There's just not enough resources available. The houseless matter. Those with mental health issues and addiction difficulties matter. Chris mattered. And he's loved and he's missed, and my heart breaks every day for him and everyone in those circumstances and those who love him. Wow, so thank you. Thank you for hearing my story. And now I'd like to pass it to Kaya Sand, the Director of Street Roots.
Kaya, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I just thank you so much, Hope, for sharing a little bit of Chris with us this morning. So I do want to just take a moment and honor him and the other 125 people who are represented in this report. That is the heart of everything that we're talking about this morning. I'm Kaya Sand. I'm the Executive Director of Street Roots, and for nearly a decade, we've been publishing this report each year with Multnomah County and its medical examiner. We do this because as a newspaper and an advocacy organization that works alongside hundreds of people experiencing homelessness, we're committed to bringing to light meaningful information. Informed about the public health consequences of life on the streets, we can more effectively act. And there are harsh patterns worth noting. As others have noted this morning, people on the streets died decades before their time, and this year's average is really similar to every year. It's 46 years old. Another pattern that we see is that Black and Indigenous people, just as they are overrepresented in homelessness, died at a higher rate in 2020 than white Portlanders experiencing homelessness did. People living their lives in public are consistently overrepresented by homicides, something we really noticed this year. And every year, people medicate their struggles and die in that way. And more, it's the viciousness of methamphetamines that are taking lives. So in other words, the harshest edges of human experience are suffered by people who are in fact already suffering. This report underscores as it does every year, that providing housing and support services are essentially about saving lives. When a person secures housing, they can stay out of this report's heartbreaking tally. So that's why at Street Roots, every time someone gets housing or secures the services they desire, we celebrate. Over the last couple months, we've been hearing a lot of those stories. A woman who just a month ago got housing, and she told me that what she wanted for a housewarming is an upside down pineapple cake. A man who finally, after more than a decade on the streets, can grow a houseplant, and that's what he wanted to do first. A man who just got housing, and he has struggled for years with an addiction to methamphetamines, and he's tried to go into recovery, and he's always told me that he can't balance survival and recovery. He could only have a fighting chance if he could get inside. He always was trying to stay awake at night, both to be able to stay out of violence or to stay alert to violence, and also, in fact, to stay awake because of rats. So people are always medicating their experience on the streets. So we're only a week away from what we always honor as the Homeless Memorial Day on the winter solstice. It's the darkest day of the year. And I do want to mention that this year, Sisters of the Road and Ground Score will hold a public vigil on Northwest 6th and Davis at 4:30. And at Street Roots, in the morning, we'll light candles as we do every year. And this year, we're going to start a new tradition of also mounding up house keys alongside those candles as hope that more people can live. So I am the last person on the speaker docket. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kate for, I believe, questions.
Thank you, Kaya, and thank you to all of our speakers. Feel free to turn your videos on to take some questions. So if reporters, if you have questions and would like to just drop those into the chat, we'll take those in order. And again, with those who spoke, but we also have Chief Medical Legal Death Investigator Kim DeLeo and Health Department Director Ebony Clark. Oh, and I see in the chat right now, Emily Green is asking a question. Why doesn't the county include data from hospitals on deaths of patients experiencing homelessness who were admitted for more than 24 hours in order to calculate a more complete number?
I can talk about this if somebody else jump in if they have some more recent information. But we've tried over the years to get data from hospitals, and we have not been successful. That has been the understanding in the past. And I don't know, Jennifer or Dr. Vines, if you have any updates or anything to add.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Actually, Kim DeLeo can speak very well to that. Go ahead, Kim.
You're on mute, Kim.
Thank you. For deaths occurring in the hospital that are natural deaths, where the individual has been hospitalized for greater than 24 hours, those aren't reportable to the medical examiner's office. So it would be very difficult for us to track those under medical examiner jurisdiction. We actually do not have jurisdiction in those cases. There is, however, a new a bill, I believe 850, that was passed that requires hospitals, anyone who is completing death certificate information to include the housing status on the official death certificate paperwork. So that should be, going forward, we should be able to track through vital statistics those cases that are not reported to the medical examiner's office.
Thank you. And Sarah Klein had a question. And again, folks, feel free to just let me know you have a question, and you can unmute yourselves. But Sarah Klein is asking, in 2020, what was the number of people experiencing homelessness who died that were found in outdoor public spaces, such as sidewalks, parks, and homeless encampments? Sarah, I can drop that in to the chat for everybody. It's going to be found in the report.
And I actually have it right here, Kate, while you do that. So the total number was 62, about 49%, so almost half in an outdoor public space.
Yeah, Maggie, go ahead. Maggie Vespa.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm wondering if Ms. Yamasaki is comfortable. I mean, just first listening to you, I'm so sorry for what you and your family have been through, and our whole team was just, gutted listening to your story and your son's story. And I noticed one thing you said was that, it's a lot harder than people think to get help and to get resources. And I'm wondering if you were surprised, if you thought it would have been easier to get resources, and how that struck you watching your son kind of get bounced from facility to facility and being turned away like that. Like, what was going through your mind when that was happening?
Yeah, absolutely. It was much harder than I thought until I had to navigate the system because, you just call the 411 or you take people in places, but that's not enough. Like sometimes people can be treated for maybe a couple days somewhere, but then they're released. And that's not enough to get someone stable. And then the more times that happens, the less they're even likely to take people in. Like, it was really hard. You can't just call somewhere. And especially when people are having like addiction and mental health, there's small windows of where they want to get help. And you need to be able to get them help in those windows when you can find them and they're stable, they're realizing what they need, and there was nowhere to take them in those moments. Like we drove, we went to Washington, went to all the walk-in detox centers I could find anywhere, and no one would take him because it was methamphetamine. Because that would be a track if he would have gotten there possibly to be able to get continuing treatment. But it was really hard, really, really hard to get treatment at all.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope. Jim, I think you had a question. Do you want to unmute yourself? I don't know that it was particularly clear for me.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Some homeless people living outside have been quoted as saying that they will not go to the indoor shelters because they are so poorly run that there's violence and property thefts and things like that. Are the indoor shelters really that poorly run that people vulnerable outside are choosing not to go to them?
What I can say is that our shelters are always full to the extent that we can have them be full. So we also do know that indoor shelter, congregate living shelter is not for everyone. And that's why we have worked hard to expand the options of folks. But whether it's indoor shelter or safe rest villages, it's all just a stopgap to really what we believe the solution is, which is providing people with a place to call home, a place of their own. For some, it's just getting in out of the elements and in a safe place. For others, they like some of the folks who are profiled in this report, that they will need more than just keys to an apartment. They will need varying levels of intense services. And individualized services based on their needs. We know there's not enough, and that's what we're working very hard to do.
And Chair, this is Ebony Clark, Health Department Director. I just want to add to what Chair Kafoury said is that also has what helped inform, our intentionality as we work to build the Behavioral Health Resource Center that is specifically targeted for those who are impacted by chronic homelessness, which oftentimes also are impacted by severe and persistent mental illness. And so we really try to take a trauma-informed approach as we work to build out the facility, thinking about, some of the specific symptoms and times where an individual may be triggered. And so, the Behavioral Health Resource Center will have a mental health shelter that will better accommodate those who are impacted by chronic mental illness and better suited to have somewhat of a more private option in a shelter. So just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ebony. And I think, Kellee Azar, you had a question?
Yes, thank you for taking my question. And Hope, I also want to tell you that we appreciate you sharing your story today, and our hearts are with you. I want to follow up on Maggie's question. When I hear the story of Chris and what he and his family went through, this sounds like, a young man who wanted help, who looked for help, who attempted to get help and had support with his family to try and do so. Chair, this might be for you, I don't know, but do stories like this make you see or realize that maybe something's failing here? I mean, we have someone who wants help and who had tried relentlessly, it sounds like, with his family, only to end up, on the street and a part of this count.
Well, what I see, and from reading the report and what I hear when I listen to stories from people like Hope and the families and individuals who are struggling right now to get into services, is that there is a definite lack of services for people who want it. We know that we have a severe shortage in behavioral healthcare providers. We know that it's not easy to get on the lists, and as Hope talked about, if you miss your appointment, you can be up. We know that there's a lot more to be done, and we also know that it's not just the services; it's the housing as well. It's having that tie together, and that's why, as I said in my comments, I'm so grateful and thankful for the voters of Multnomah County and the Tri-County region who passed the supportive services measure, which will now give us the opportunity to scale up to a level we just haven't had the dollars to do so before. Also, with the passage of Measure 110, I'm very hopeful that we will have an additional resource to increase access to treatment. And then, as Ebony Clark talked about, our current Multnomah County Health Department Director, having the Behavioral Healthcare Resource Center will also be a really crucial next step. So I think that's one of the reasons we do this report too, is to guide us in how we can do things better and more be more successful in the future. And one of those ways is adding additional ways and avenues for people to get into the services that they need.
Thank you. And if I can also ask a follow-up question really quick, and Dr. Vines, this might be for you, or I'm not really sure. I'll just ask. When Hope's talking about her son, having obviously some mental health concerns, and then also having, drug issues as well, how often do those two things, go hand in hand? Obviously, I don't need like a specific number, but I'm assuming that's not a rare combination, because as we've heard in the countless stories that we've told around this town, is that, sometimes people self-medicate. So are those, often connected?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that those are often connected. You hear the term dual diagnosis. It's been referenced here. It means behavioral health diagnosis and a substance use disorder diagnosis. And it can be chicken or egg if, which one fuels the other. But the bottom line is people have two needs that need to be addressed. And so there's a real need for our behavioral health system to be able to help those people. And I don't know, Julie Lukash or Ebony Clark, if you want to say more.
Yeah, what I'll just add to that is that what we often find is that folks tend to more often than none start off with a mental health issue, challenge, and or diagnosis, which tends to lead to self-medication, and addiction. And so that's something that's recognized, and one of the things that, at Multnomah County in our behavioral health division, we really work also to equally raise up and prioritize the needs for substance use disorder treatment, because oftentimes I think that a lot of times it's seen as very separate, but they are very interconnected, just like recognizing, as Chair Kafoury spoke to, having a place to lay your head often is very interconnected with your stability in all other areas. Being able to have a place to lay your head increases your likelihood of being able to engage and complete treatment. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. Nicole from the Oregonian had a question. And I think this is a two-parter. The second piece might be for Kim. How deep is the investigation for each individual case? For example, do we know how many individuals who died were in some sort of outpatient mental health program? So how much of a person's backstory do you get?
Sure, I can take that. We conduct thorough death investigations to determine the cause and manner of death. Sometimes we have, more information available in medical records than we do for some other cases. We may or may not know if someone is receiving outpatient treatment if it's not listed in an initial medical record that we have access to. Currently, the medical examiner's office does not compile or track any deaths regarding outpatient facilities.
And then it looks like Nicole had just a second part to that question, which was asking about trends in fentanyl deaths.
Yes.
Whether that's you or Dr. Vines.
I could say that it looks like there were 4 fentanyl deaths this year specifically for Domicile Unknown. We didn't notice any trends per se in these 4, but we have seen increase in fentanyl over the last, several years. It's been increasing each year. The current trend on is M80, kind of fake oxycodone pills, the fake Xanax pills. I know that several bulletins have been released previously. Hopefully we'll have some, final numbers that we can release regarding fentanyl overdoses. Hopefully soon.
Thank you. And then it looks like Alex Zielinski, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. My question is kind of both for maybe Chair Kafoury and Dr. Vines. Chair, you mentioned that each year these reports inform policy decisions kind of going forward. And I'm curious what you think the biggest lessons from the 2020 report is, and kind of what stands out the most to you as something that can be and should be addressed by policymakers going forward.
I really think our goal for this next year is increasing the number of places where people can get help and the number of folks out there in the community who can give help. And then ensuring that people who need it and want it are connected to the services that are available. So that to me is my greatest takeaway as we work to increase the number of supportive services, housing beds available. We need to really ramp up the number of services that are available for our community members.
Yeah, thanks. I agree completely. And I would just only add that I think services specific to substance use and behavioral health, I think that's implicit in the chair's comments, but I think this report really makes that quite stark.
Thank you so much. And I think Kristian, you, Foden, you were next up.
Thank you. I just wondered, when thinking about death, somebody might be in the middle of crisis or something like that. And I was wondering whether we have a system or an organization that literally drops by camps to knock on the door, as it were, and say, are you doing okay? Or whether that's would be a waste of money, or it might stop some of these deaths because people be like, I'm in the crisis, or I don't know. Does that happen, or is that a dumb idea, or I don't know?
No, Kristian, that's not a dumb idea. That's a great idea. And we do every year in our budget, we've increased the number of outreach workers that we have. Some of them have specialties. Some of them are behavioral health outreach specialists. Some of them, and we've increased those in the past years. Some folks assess people to try to get them onto the lists so that they can get into our shelters or into housing. And some people are out passing out water and getting people connected to medical attention if they need it. So there are, I don't have the number, maybe Dennis can put it in the chat, of the number of outreach workers that we have who go around our community to have a connection with people who are living in our camps. One of the other things that we do know is that a lot of folks who are living off the grid and away from society, really, they need that human connection. So establishing a relationship with someone and having consistent contact from the same person shows that the community hasn't forgotten about them, that they're still valued and that people care about them, and that helps get people, another way of helping get people into the behavioral health supports that they need.
All right, thanks.
And I don't see any other questions in the chat or anybody else in the chat. You're welcome. Anybody and any reporters are welcome to reach out to me and Julie after this if you have any further questions. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you, Hope, for coming today. And thank you all for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.